Hello, and thank you for joining us for a special report online. I'm James Rosen, sitting in for Brett Baer. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. This is a great forum to continue the conversation with our all-star panel. We want to hear from you, so please weigh in and ask us some questions. Let's bring in the panel once again. Jonah Goldberg, senior editor at National Review, Susan Page, Washington bureau chief at USA Today, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. We want, I think, to begin with the most important issue of the day. Regrettably, it wasn't covered in the panel that you all did on the show with Brett just now, and that is the issue of who or what is covfefe. So let's look at the president's tweets. Despite the constant negative press covfefe, he tweeted after midnight. And then I guess he tweeted a second time. Do we have that one? He said, who can figure out the true meaning of covfefe? Question mark, question mark, question mark. Enjoy. That was about 6 hours later, perhaps realizing the unintelligibility of the first tweet. And then there was an exchange with Sean Spicer, the press secretary at the White House, later about this.
People should be concerned that the president posted somewhat of an incoherent tweet last night and that it then stayed up for hours.
No.
Why did it stay up so long? Is no one watching this?
The president and a small group of people know exactly what he meant.
The president and a small group of people know exactly what he meant, and so now we put to the test whether anyone in that small group of people who know what the president meant is seated on this panel with me right now. Jonah.
Well, look, I mean, I think it was Socrates who says never go full covfefe, I'm at a. So I've been polling people whether they think Sean Spicer was joking with that answer, and opinions are split. If you go to some other networks, they treat it as if it was a sort of reenactment of the great Charles Bronson movie Telephone, where Donald Trump was intentionally activating sleeper cells or something like that. I'm agnostic. I do think it was probably what the kids today call trolling, where you just sort of say stuff that deliberately is going to drive people crazy. I'm talking about Sean Spicer. Online. Yeah. I think what Sean Spicer was doing was just sort of stoking this.
And if that's true, is the bully pulpit of the White House an appropriate place for that kind of conduct?
No. And I think that they should. Sean Spicer says about almost every other tweet the president does, I think the tweet speaks for itself. That should have been his answer, and let people deal with it. Instead, it fuels this speculation that Sean Spicer can't even admit that his boss can commit a typo.
Oh, please.
And
lighten up. I mean, he made a joke to something that was itself a joke. I like the image of Donald Trump dozing off, trying to send off a final tweet, falling asleep in mid-tweet, misspelling, clearly the word coverage, and then waking up 6 hours later and sending out a joke about it. I mean, of all the serious and very ponderous issues that we have to consider, this was just funny.
Now, just in
you don't hear anyone in the look. I'm open to the idea that it's joking. I will say that I think that Sean Spicer's delivery needs work if he was going for yucks. But I kind of hope it was joking. I also think that this is the kind of. Even if he was joking, it would have been just better if he just was like, okay, it was a typo, move on. I thought Trump's response was great. Like, figure it out,
Florida Barry posts to us, it's Russian for foobar. We're going to assume you know what foobar means. Susan, but in laying out that scenario just now that you did of the president drifting into drowsiness and mistakenly tweeting, that's just your speculation, correct? You haven't run that down with sources.
I do not. I have zero anonymous or on-the-record sources telling me this, but it seems to me that is the most obvious and easiest explanation, and that is usually the correct one.
Charles, the term itself, covfefe, sounds to me like it could be any number of things, like one of those unappetizing European chocolates that we don't like here in America. Whoa, let's have a little piece of covfefe with it. Or one of those older and now politically incorrect cartoon characters' names. What say you?
I think if you'd gone to divinity school, you'd know that it's the 40 days preceding Festivus. President,
yes.
There's a small circle of people in the White House who celebrate that. And the president probably was not supposed to let it out, but apparently he knows. Look, there's a vast right-wing conspiracy out there. They use code. We don't even know what the code is. And this is stuff to actually be fearful about.
or co-fearful?
I wouldn't treat it with the levity that you do.
He said with a smile. All right, let's move on to only marginally more serious things, right? First of all, Hillary Clinton's appearance Code conference alongside Walt Mossberg, I believe it was, correct? Am I right about that? Where she spoke at greater length than she has before about why she thinks she lost the election. She said she takes responsibility for all of her decisions, but then very pointedly noted she doesn't think it was her decisions or conduct that cost her the election. And she also paid particular attention to the long scandal over her email server. Let's listen to what she said.
The overriding issue that affected the election that I had any control over, because I had no control over the Russians. Too bad about that, but we'll talk about it, I hope, was the way that the use of my email account was turned into, you know, the biggest scandal since Lord knows when.
Now, we shouldn't imagine that Hillary Clinton, at this late stage of things, is going to be inclined to quote James Comey often, but she might have pointed to his statement on July 5 that her conduct with respect to this email server was extremely careless, I think was his exact words. He also said it was possible at that time that the establishment of that private server in the way it was run and everything could have exposed the Secretary of State to potential foreign hostile actor intrusion on that server. And perhaps that's why it was turned into the biggest scandal since Lord knows when. Susan?
Well, you know, it's been 6 months since the election. Elections are tough, hard-fought. A presidential election is a very painful thing to lose. We know that from all the people who have lost presidential elections before her. But Hillary Clinton's continued unwillingness to acknowledge the original sin of the campaign, which was, as she was becoming Secretary of State, establishing a private email server to use exclusively for her emails, is I think, disappointing to her supporters. Because there are lots of reasons you lose elections, and there were some unfair things that happened to Hillary Clinton. But she's the person who showed the poor judgment to establish this private email server, and she paid a huge price for it. There's no question about it.
Jonah, there's quite a large number of Democrats who supported Hillary Clinton as the nominee in the fall election, but who probably don't agree with her about why exactly she lost this election, and we might call those people Bernie Sanders supporters.
No, that's right. You know, and the problem with taking just the individual sound bites of these individual explanations is you lose the full totality of it. It reminds me of that scene in the Blues Brothers where John Belushi is explaining to Carrie Fisher why he's left her at the altar, and he's like, "My car broke down. There was a flood. Locust. It's not my fault." And he just runs through this long string of things. She literally lists every conceivable explanation to exonerate herself in it. And the one I think that it was most intriguing is when she was talking about how, I think it was about the email, the coverage of the email stuff and her speeches, and then she says, and at some point that coverage became so unfair that it bleeds into misogyny. And this is a problem that Hillary Clinton has had for a very long time, and a lot of her supporters have had for a very long time. You can have negative views about Hillary Clinton, the person, without necessarily having negative views about women in general. And she constantly tries to use this language of she's the Joan of Arc of womankind. And so any negative treatment or unfair treatment of her is really based in some bias against all women, when really it may be unfair, but it's not unfair against women, it's unfair against her. And I don't think a lot of it was unfair. All of these things don't sort of explain why she didn't go to Wisconsin. They don't explain why she didn't work better in Pennsylvania. They don't explain, as Charles brought up during the panel, why, after literally running for president since she graduated from college, she hasn't come up with a way to explain what her message is. She was just a bad candidate. And there was always this idea, you know, look, my wife can speak passable Russian. When I married her, I didn't all of a sudden get the gift of being able to speak Russian. Political skill is not transferable. It doesn't become community property. Bill Clinton was a one-of-a-kind, generational, talented politician. She's not, and she never was, and she always thought like it would be her turn. And the mother of all populist times to run a campaign basically based on the idea it's her turn for the restoration of the Clinton dynasty was poisonous and foolhardy.
Don't think I've forgiven you for your negative invocation of Nixonian in the TV panel earlier, which was shameful on your part. You know, to Jonah's point, though, I remember watching via remote satellite feed Coretta Scott King's funeral, and former President Clinton spoke first. It was sort of a theater in the round setting, and by the time he was done, it had the feel of a gospel proceeding in an African American church. Everyone was hooting and hollering, and he was having a good old time, and he just got everybody stoked up, and he was the first African American president again, and it was just an extraordinary and just sort of shared joy between him and the audience. And then Hillary Clinton got up to speak, probably making the mistake of following her husband, and she spoke in a kind of very deliberate way and more or less mercilessly asphyxiated the oxygen from the room. And it spoke to the contrast in their styles and their outcomes, do you think?
You know, I would say your Bill Clinton impression is pretty good, but your Hillary Clinton impression is really just terrible.
Okay. All right. Hashtag terrible.
Bleeds into misogyny.
I agree.
Oh, well, it must. Terry MD posts to us, Hillary, yet another Mrs. Macbethish acting performance of playing the victim. Trouble is she believes in her role. And so let's go to the question of Hillary Clinton's mental state, as best we can discern it. Dr. Krauthammer, the reason you are thusly addressed is because you have a degree in psychiatry. Am I correct?
I am a psychiatrist, but I do not play one on TV. Because there's no way to know. I just thought I mean, I think I'm the only one on the panel who felt sympathy for her. She really is a sad figure. Yeah, I know, and I'm often criticized, how can you? Well, you know, maybe I'm just a softie at heart. After all, I was a liberal in my youth. But my objection to her performance today is linguistic. There's now a trend where everybody's using the word weaponize. It's become the newest meme. Weaponized her emails against her, and thus they had to have had an American working the Russians with them to be able to weaponize. What does it take to understand that if you get the emails of a campaign manager showing all the snarkiness and the emptiness and the lack of any message or the lack of anything compelling about a campaign, that you would actually leak it? I mean, the idea that they have weaponized the emails is ridiculous. They leaked it. So I know this is a small point, but I do take words seriously. I don't take psychoanalysis that seriously. But the word offense here, I think, is a hanging one.
To your point, to weaponize something is to take something which was innocuous and not capable of being used as a weapon and somehow modify it so that it can, in fact, be used for that purpose. Yeah. The emails were already loaded with ammunition, right, in a sense.
Although I don't think the emails were, the content of the emails themselves didn't seem to me to be so terrible. It was the kind of the fact of the emails, and it was the use of the server, and it all became kind of bigger than its parts. It seemed to me, and they never really effectively answered that. And I'll tell you one question that came up in my mind watching Hillary Clinton talking at this conference was, what is her agenda in coming out at this point in making this case? Is it to restore her reputation? Does she think does she have political ambitions for the future? Is it simply to vent? Or is it simply to vent?
If she does, then she really does need my professional services. Have ambitions for a future. It's possible. I think it's unbelievably unlikely. And I think it would be sort of in keeping with the grandiosity that she has displayed. I think.
Who says you're averse to psychoanalyzing on the air? Grandiosity.
Grandiosity is a layman's term. I'm not using in the DSM-5 meaning of it. Since college, she's always thought of herself as sort of deserving of the ultimate prize. Her husband earned it because he was a charming rogue, one of the great politicians of our time. As you described the ceremony at Coretta Scott King's funeral, it's sort of unfair to compare anybody to Bill Clinton. Probably Obama is the only one in his league as a kind of political talent. She wasn't even a mediocre political talent. She was a terrible candidate, and that's why she lost the election.
Just to make a small point, she ran a terrible campaign, no question. She was a terrible candidate. She did win 2 Senate elections, And she did serve as secretary. I mean, she did have real achievements. We shouldn't cast her in a totally negative light. And she had, and 3 million more people voted for her than voted for Donald Trump. So we shouldn't forget that in the discussion of Hillary Clinton.
Fair enough.
She still lost to one of the more, shall we say, unusual, and I would argue one of the weaker candidates that Republicans had to offer, who was continually getting himself in trouble, who got into a 2-week spat with Gold Star parents. I mean, this is sort of...
And the Pope.
So Nan with a plan. Nan with a plan posed to us. Weaponize is the new optics.
That's a good point.
I am struck
or narrative.
by
narrative.
Narrative. That's
Can
a good one.
anybody say
Branding.
Story? What's this narrative?
So, Susan, one parallel that I'm struck by is that during the campaign, when the Democratic side of things was beset by these leaks of emails, and it wasn't just the emails pouring out of Hillary Clinton's private server, it was also the emails exchanged among top officials at the DNC and then Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, right? The 3 giant sets of emails, all of them loaded with rather interesting material. At the time, the Clinton forces said, in essence, you shouldn't be focused on the substance of these things. You should be focused on the outrageous intervention and the leakage of them. And I'm struck by now how we have the Trump administration, in essence, saying you shouldn't be focused on the substance of the leaks against this administration, but the outrageous fact that they're being leaked. Yeah. This is classified material and so on. Is there a parallel there?
The parallel is that neither strategy is going to have any effect. No one's going to pay. People brushed aside the argument by the Clinton campaign that we shouldn't even report on the emails because they were represented such an outrageous thing. And believe me, no one's going to be declined to pursue the Russia story with the Trump campaign because of the White House complaints about it.
The lesson of that parallel is that hypocrisy is literally in the air in Washington. The minute you cross the Beltway and you enter, there should be a giant sign from the FDA. Beware, the air in this city will turn you into a hypocrite within an hour. There's no principle involved here. If your side is at the receiving end of leaks, you complain about leaks. If your side is on the attacking side of leaks, that's not the real story. The real story is what's in the leaks. And this is, I mean, if anybody who's been here for a week understands that that's the coin of the realm. In Washington, there's hypocrisy, and it's not even noticed.
And we should note, just for the record, that James, by asking this question, is eliding over the fact that he lives off of that coin of the realm.
Which coin?
Leaks. And, you know, and reporters, I think, are fascinated by this question of sort of defending leaks or the propriety of leaks, in part because that's how they do their jobs. And there's a certain amount of, I heard that the faintest suggestion of what they call the business press talking your book, as it were, when you point out the prevalence of these leaks.
I liked it better when you were quoting Jake and Elwood Blues. So, C.C. Walla posts to us, Trump won because the Founding Fathers didn't want one section of the country to rule over the entire country. I gather that's a reference to the disparity in the popular vote that Susan mentioned. Right. Let's move briefly to the story that I reported on at the top of Special Report tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, which had to do with the issuance of subpoenas by the House Intelligence Committee. One of the aspects of this that I think is most striking, aside from who was named, which was Susan Rice, John Brennan, and now Samantha Power, and the addition of Samantha Power is quite striking. We talked about that. But I find it interesting that Chairman Nunes signed all of these subpoenas, as is standard practice for committees that issue subpoenas, that the chairman or the chair shall be the one that signs, the signatory. He had stepped aside from the Russia angle of his panel's investigation back in April, after the House Ethics Committee agreed to review his handling of classified information at one point. He's still waiting for a hearing on that, but he maintains he never recused himself. He just stepped aside, and that he is the active chairman of the panel, and that he is actively running the unmasking slice of things. We heard from Congressman Adam Schiff, the ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee today, who said, in essence, that those 3 subpoenas on the unmasking activity meant to FBI, CIA, and NSA, mentioning Rice, Brennan, and Power, were, in essence, really not endorsed by the Democratic half or the Democratic side of the aisle there. Susan.
Did Congressman Schiff object to the idea that Chairman Nunes was involved in the unmasking side of this investigation?
So this is reporting from Chad Pergram, our ace congressional producer who knows the Hill better than anyone. He writes that a senior House Intelligence Committee aide said, if the reports are accurate, the subpoenas related to the unmasking issue would have been sent by Chairman Nunes acting separately from the committee's Russia investigation. This action would have been taken without the minority's agreement. Any prior request for information would have been undertaken without the minority's knowledge. But yes, privately, I am given to understanding that the Democrats are grumbling that Nunes is involved to the degree he is.
Well, I think it is surprising because because of his behavior that raised questions about his handling of classified material, and also whether he accurately conveyed how he got the material that he then talked about, raised questions about his judgment in this area. So I'm surprised that he's back even on the, and I realize the unmasking track is a little different, distinct from the Russia meddling track, but they're related. So I'm surprised to hear this.
We should point out, by the way, I'll come right to you, Charles, that Judicial Watch has asked the House Ethics Committee to undertake a similar investigation of the handling of classified information by Representative Schiff himself and by Representative Speer, who are also members of another member of the Intelligence Committee, for their discussion of information, apparently allegedly classified information in news conference settings. And so far, the House Ethics Committee has taken a lot longer to announce whether it's going to take up those investigations than it did the Nunes matter. And the simple fact is that people who cover the Hill know that the House Ethics Committee, its actual members, really don't even have the security clearances necessary to examine these kinds of allegations, whether it's of Republicans or Democrats. Charles.
I think this is a snake swallowing its tail. We're going around and around into, I mean, we're getting so deep into these investigations of leaks of investigations, you don't know where it's going to stop. But I must say that my problem here is, again, a Jesuitical linguistic complaint, which is if Nunes did not recuse himself but said he would step aside, aren't those the same thing?
Well, no, he makes a distinction that a recusal is a formal technical term of art with certain legal implications, and that stepping aside from one sliver of the investigation has different implications.
Well, it sounds like he's recusing himself when he steps aside. But nonetheless, I still am obsessed with the word weaponized. I think we should.
I'm still obsessed with covfefe, to be honest. Jonah, did you want to weigh in on the issuance of these indictments?
Yeah,
Excuse me, I said indictments. I meant subpoenas. I correct myself fully hereby.
Yeah.
Subpoenas.
Dodge that bullet. I think it's interesting. I think as an inside baseball kind of thing, the grumbling from the Democrats is interesting. We'll see where that goes. I do think that unless there is some blockbuster, I mean, Susan made this point during the panel, unless there was some blockbuster revelation about Samantha Power or Susan Rice or Brennan that really can break through the, sorry, Charles, narrative out there and get the attention of the American people, that the coverage is all going to be about the Trump administration subpoenas, the ones for his lawyer, the ones for Flynn, and all that. And there may be no smoking gun there either, but that's just where the feeding frenzy is right now. And in order to sort of break us out of that, it would require finding out something not only really important, but also really understandable. And part of the problem about trying to talk about weaponizing language, unmasking is different than revealing names. You know, it's a technical term of art inside, and it gets very, very complicated and very hard to break through.
The one rejoinder to what you're saying, though, it seems to me, is that in the case of the unmasking, it seems to be the only palpable crime that's yet been established, which was the unmasking of Flynn's name and the apparently and the leaking of that classified data to the news media. The whole issue with respect to alleged collusion is that, unlike a great old episode of Columbo, which starts off with the murder that we then proceed to solve, we haven't yet established in almost a year's worth of FBI investigation any actual crime associated with this purported collusion. Is that correct, Susan?
We're still in the early stages of this investigation, and we've had this flood of leaks, really, I think, unprecedented in my time in Washington, how leaky this town has become. One thing we do know from the situation with the House Intelligence Committee is the idea that this was going to be some kind of bipartisan inquiry, which was perhaps never actually believed in town, but the idea that that is something that could happen, I think, sounds like it is eroding fast. The Senate Intelligence Committee, which is proceeding with less public controversy, though, looks like it may be pretty bipartisan, at least at the moment, and will be tested, I think, with former Director Comey testifying probably next week.
Just one point on the leakiness of Washington right now. I think that in some ways is the best argument in defense of the Trump administration and the charges of collusion. Every single damning thing you can imagine leaks within minutes for the last 6 months or whatever, and yet nothing has leaked about the actual substance of these charges.
Of the collusion,
of the charge of collusion. And if there was some concrete evidence of that, you would think, you know, these deep state rogues they're trying to undo an election that everyone keeps talking about would leak some of it. And yet it just strikes me as very strange that that's the one thing everyone agrees to keep really secret. It's kind of proving a negative, but you know, you would think it would come out if there were found something.
It's salient by its omission, in essence. Charles, you have about 20 seconds.
Well, this has, I think, become, to our frustration, but it seems to me unique. It's the cover-up in search of a crime. Trump says there's nothing here. So far, there's no evidence of anything here, but he's been acting as if there's everything there. And that's the reason that it keeps on going. In the sense, you can say, the narrative has been weaponized and the optics are terrible.
Terrible, of course, is a legal term of art as well. All right, thank you, Jonah, Susan, and Charles, and thanks to all of you who tuned in for this reemergence of Special Report Online. I'm James Rosen, sitting in for Bret Baier. Bret's back in the Special Report chair tomorrow, and you won't want to miss him at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Take care.